Hello viewers, this is An American Thinks, and as promised, we are back again with a follow-up video on The North Remembers. Now this video will cover a variety of topics lurking in the background of that first video, a few of which were brought up in the comments of that video, and I should preface this by saying, for full disclosure, my theory videos follow the canon of the books, and since the canon of the TV show is known to diverge from the canon of the books, my theories only apply to the TV show to the extent that the events of the TV show and the books overlap. Now, let's get to it. The first big question that was brought up by several viewers is what kind of trade or economy does the North have? After all, it is generally reputed to be the poorest of the seven kingdoms. Now we do have a few hints for this, and I'll begin, as I so often do, with a map of Westeros. And now looking at this map, we see that we have forests here in the south of Westeros called the Rainwood, with the Kingswood slightly above to the north, another unnamed forest to the west near Crake Hall, the Whispering Wood up near River Run, and finally a wooded area here in the Vale. Now, if we look at the north, there is of course a major woodland in the neck, and the Hornwood, and a forest surrounding Carhold, and then the Wolf's Wood, which is by far the largest forest in all of Westeros. So it is very easy to suppose that the north is a major timber supplier for Westeros. Certainly there are other forests in the south of Westeros that could supply timber, but with the smaller forests in the south, and a greater number of people living in the south and demanding wood products, the supply and demand indicators for southern timber imply that it would be expensive and would put the South at risk of deforestation, something that actually became an acute problem at various times in Europe's history, for example, when the population began to recover from the Black Plague and began to deforest much of Europe's countryside for wood, to build homes, ships, and for heat during the winter and so forth. But when we examine the economics of the North, with a lower population density coupled with larger forests, northern timber would be comparatively cheap and the risk of deforestation much less severe. Consequently, it is likely a major timber supplier for Westeros. Additionally, with ports in Essos such as Braavos, Pentos, Myr, Tyrosh, and so on, which are major shipping hubs, but which don't have native timber supplies with which to build merchant marine fleets, the North likely supplies timber customers outside of Westeros as well. And in addition to being a timber supplier, the North is likely a major supplier of charcoal, since it has the cheapest source of timber with which to make charcoal, and they likely make significant amounts of charcoal for themselves with which to keep themselves warm during their long winters. In fact, this is another example of the Boltons getting the short end of the economic stick in the North that I mentioned in the first video. With no major source of timber in their holdings, providing heat during the winters would be an expensive proposition. This would leave them with much less expendable income with which to better their house in other ways. Again, this is a position you would expect for a house that historically opposed and made war on the Starks. Now, probably the export from the North most frequently mentioned in the books is fish. Apparently there's fish everywhere in the North, and they're even specifically mentioned as being in the northern rivers. Inadvertently, we have a good analog for this in Earth's history as well. During the Middle Ages throughout the Catholic world, it became common practice to abstain from eating meat on Friday, since Jesus died on the cross on a Friday. However, fish was not considered meat, so a growing demand for fish ensued. And as the lakes and rivers of continental Europe became depleted of fish, the Europeans began to rely on imported fish, particularly imported codfish from Norway. Now, Norway has chronically had limited arable land, and Norwegians had long plied the North Atlantic for fish with which to supplement their own diets. And with a sudden demand for fish from continental Europe, the Norwegians found themselves in something of an economic boom. The only difficulty, however, was the time it took to move the fish from the place where they were caught to the place where they were being eaten. Fish isn't generally known for keeping very well, and in the days before modern refrigeration, a preservation technique was needed to keep the fish from rotting before reaching their final market. The solution was salt. Salt has long been used as a preservative of all kinds of meats, and was used in mass quantities to enable Norwegian fish production during the Middle Ages. So if we take the Norwegian model as an analog for northern fish trade, we'd have to expect to find some source of salt in the world of ice and fire that could enable the northern fish trade. And as it turns out, there probably is one. At the western end of the Bay of Crabs sits a town called Salt Pans, which is a colloquial term in our world's history for the evaporative pools that have historically been used to distill salt from seawater. Salt Pans is also on the correct side of Westeros, the eastern side, with good access to the four most important northern rivers. So we should expect that the North does a healthy trade back and forth with salt pans, importing salt, so that they can in turn export fish. And it would make sense that following her escape from Harrenhal, Arya Stark hoped to find a ship at Salt Pans to take her north. It would also make sense that anyone trying to damage the northern economy would raise the town to limit the northern supply of salt. And it would also make sense that if Rorge really was surreptitiously working for the House of Black and White, and the house was trying to find Arya Stark, they would want the town burned as well, so that northern ships would stop coming to port, and the only ship waiting to sail overseas would be Braavosi. And finally, if we look at a map of Westeros as a whole, we'll see that the north is around half the size of all the rest of Westeros put together. So I personally wouldn't be that surprised if normal agricultural output managed to find its way out of the north. Now, with that said, I'll agree that the land in the north is, on average, not as productive as land in the south would be, since the higher latitudes result in shorter growing seasons and longer winters, and also because much of the north is covered by the Wolfswood and by mountains along its northwest, and these areas generally aren't useful for agricultural production. But at the same time, the south also has several mountain ranges, and the entire region of Dorne is marginally productive for agriculture. And just due to the sheer landmass of the north compared to the rest of the continent, I wouldn't be surprised at all to see grain and other crops finding their way out of the north. And this will be particularly important in the final upcoming books, as the pending winter will begin to assert itself over other human activities on the continent, and since several large areas of Westeros, such as the western coast of the north, the Riverlands, and so forth, have already been pillaged by invaders, and their crops and crop stores have been eliminated, the areas that do remain untouched and are able to sustain themselves will become increasingly more valuable. Now, enough about agriculture. Let's shift gears to talk about ships, which I had several viewers ask me about in the comments of my previous video. In general, with A Song of Ice and Fire, as well as with other genre fiction, when an author uses a term that has a generally accepted meaning in our world, I tend to think the same term applies in the fictional world, unless the author specifically provides an alternative explanation. So when George R. R. Martin talks about longships, I generally accept the term longships to mean what it would mean in our world, a ship that looks like this, which many people generally associate with Norsemen from the Viking period, and for good reason. Longships allowed the Norsemen to travel virtually anywhere there was water, from rivers like the Rus River in Russia, to the Thames River, to Iceland, to Greenland, and even North America nearly 500 years before Columbus, and to trading ports in the Mediterranean. In fact, the Norsemen raided so many times up the Seine River in France that the Frankish king Charles the Simple actually gave land along France's northern coast to a Norse leader named Rollo, where he and his men could settle for free, provided they defended the coast against other Norse raiders. And the area where the Norsemen settled still bears their name today, Normandy. And the point of all this history is to demonstrate the immense usefulness of the longship. It was essentially the ATV of the medieval world, being both ocean-worthy and river-worthy, and it enabled the Vikings to accomplish all that they did. So, in A Clash of Kings, when the Umbers complained to Sir Roderick about wildling raids along their coasts, Sir Roderick is absolutely correct in telling the Umbers to send timber to the Manderleys so that the Manderleys can build longships. This is exactly the type of boat you would want in order to run down wildling raiders wherever you might find them. If you only had a ship that could navigate rivers, but not the ocean, the wildlings could simply escape to sea. Or vice versa, if you only had a ship that could navigate the ocean but not rivers, the wildlings could simply go upriver to make their escape. So you would need a ship that could do both, and longships are your best answer. But there is one thing that longships are great at, however, and that is formal naval warfare. And the reason being is they don't have rams. In an age before gunpowder, the ram was the most dangerous weapon a ship could employ for means of sinking another ship. So a longship caught in naval combat would either attempt to flee or resign itself to attempting a boarding action against its opponent, which is a particularly dangerous proposition if you are attempting to board a ship that has a ram and can sink you, but you don't have a ram that the opposing ship needs to be concerned about. And that is why, if you are planning to engage in naval warfare, you wouldn't want a longship. You would want a war galley, like this bad boy right here. You can see at the front of the ship the ram used for sinking enemy ships, and of course there are rows of oarsmen that are needed to power the ship at sufficient speed to punch through the hull of an enemy vessel. There is a trade-off to having this type of ship design, however. The ram rides below water level, so it creates more drag in the water. It is also heavy, and all the oarsmen, their equipment, and the food and water to feed the oarsmen are also heavy. So this type of ship draws more water than a longship, or in other words, it sits lower in the water, which means that it has an inherent disadvantage for navigating rivers. In the comments of my prior North Remembers video, I had an interesting discussion with user Praetorian Gaming regarding whether war galleys could navigate the White Knife to participate in the Battle of Winterfell. Ultimately, I think my conclusion is yes, maybe, I'm not sure. If we take a look at a map of the North again, we notice that White Harbor appears to sit not quite at the mouth of the White Knife, but perhaps just slightly upriver. It's hard to tell because the level of detail in fantasy maps is inherently restricted, but other maps of Westeros show a similar location for White Harbor. And I believe the vassals of Kingsgrave actually spent some time discussing this in their video on the North. But this location wouldn't be entirely unprecedented in our world. For example, let's take a look at a few locations of major ports on major rivers in America. This is a map of Portland, Oregon. It is the largest port on the Columbia River, which is a major river in North America's Pacific Northwest. You'll notice that it's well upriver of the mouth of the Columbia River, where it enters the Pacific Ocean, and for good reason. The mouth of the Columbia River doesn't provide a good natural harbor sheltered from the Pacific Ocean. I lived in Portland for several years before moving to Colorado, and the first place I ever went surfing was actually on the Oregon coast near a little town called Newport. And I can tell you, the waves on the Pacific Ocean, particularly during the winter, can be absolutely punishing. And this is extremely detrimental for ships that are trying to sit safe at your harbor. Additionally, ports that sit immediately on the sea have to contend with daily tides, which presents logistical challenges for getting ships into and out of port. So it is not unusual for ports to be a slight ways upriver to avoid these problems. Now, Portland is admittedly an exaggerated example of this. It lies a ways upriver because there is a mountain range that runs up the Oregon coast. Probably a more likely real-world analog would be something more like New Orleans, which admittedly does look like it sits right on the sea somewhat, but if you consider that at the time New Orleans was founded, Lake Bourne was really a true lake that was separated from the sea by an area of wetlands that have now since eroded, New Orleans really fits the example. It's a major port town that sits a short ways upriver from the ocean, or in this case, the Gulf of Mexico. So, can war galleys go upriver on the White Knife and similar rivers? Well, I'd say yes to an extent. They can at least go upriver as far as White Harbor, and depending on what type of river the White Knife is, they might be able to go farther. If it is like the Columbia River or the Mississippi River, then they certainly could go farther upriver, but bear in mind, if you're trying to compare the White Knife to a modern river that you are familiar with, most modern rivers, especially those used for trade, are regularly dredged and cleared of obstacles to make them suitable for ship travel. In a world like the world of Ice and Fire, no such dredging operations would be available. If you're thinking of taking a ship up such a river, particularly a ship that is heavy and rides low in the water and has a big ram riding underwater off the bow of the ship, the likelihood of getting caught on a sandbar or on a submerged tree or rock would pose significant difficulties in simply traveling upriver, much less conducting warfare on the river. So, in summary, I would posit that a war galley is primarily a seagoing naval vessel, with river travel being an inherently secondary consideration limited to only the biggest and deepest rivers. So if Wyman Manderley is intentionally building war galleys and not longships, he must be primarily concerning himself with controlling seas, not rivers. Now, there has also been some discussion over the number of war galleys that Manderley has available. In my previous video, I referenced 23 war galleys, but several users responded that the correct number should be 50. Now, I referenced 23 as this is the number that Davos Seaworth personally sees as he is visiting White Harbor. Now, later in his conversation with Wyman Manderley, Lord Manderley claims to have up to 50 war galleys at his disposal, the remainder being hidden from public view. And he could certainly raise additional ships if needed by levying merchant ships and converting them for military service. Personally, I find the count of 23 to be, of course, most reliable because a POV character has physically seen them. It may very well be that Manderley has hidden ships somewhere, but he may also be trying to pull off a deception of some kind. I mean, after all, he is talking to Davos Seaworth, who isn't exactly an ally at this point, and it would only help Manderley's case to make himself out to be more powerful than he really is. So until I actually get eyes on all 50 ships, I'll still take Wyman Manderley's claims with a grain of salt, though his claims may certainly be plausible. And finally, let's talk about naval power in general. I've also had several users comment that the Red Wines have the largest fleet in Westeros, at one time numbering 200-some warships, although a little depleted now following the Ironborn raids in the Reach. In any case, this is significantly more than Wyman Manderley's paltry fleet of either 23 or 50 ships. So what difference could Manderley really play in the naval affairs of Westeros? Well, I'd argue quite a bit, actually. As with any kind of warfare, volume of numbers doesn't really matter so much as concentration of numbers. And in Manderley's case, his numbers concentrate quite easily. As I pointed out in my previous video, the 4 southeasterly rivers in the north are the most important rivers for trade. And of these 4, the White Knife and the Broken Branch appear to be the most significant. And with the western coast of the north already raided by Ironborn, the Manderley fleet is well positioned to defend the part of the north that is most worth defending, and amounts to about this much coastline. Plus, he has the element of surprise, as it is generally not known that Manderley has amassed as much naval power as he seems to have. Meanwhile, the naval situation in the south is much more bleak. At the beginning of A Game of Thrones, there were 3 major fleets in the south of Westeros: the Red Wine Fleet, the Iron Fleet, and the Royal Fleet. But the Royal Fleet is nearly annihilated. Its captains split their support between Stannis and the Lannisters, and then both sides nearly annihilated each other at the Battle of the Blackwater. So little of that fleet currently remains. Then, when the Lannisters and the Tyrells created an alliance based on the marriage of Joffrey and Margaery, the Red Wines, who are sworn to House Tyrell, sent their fleet to support the siege of Dragonstone. And with the western coast of Westeros virtually undefended, the Iron Fleet took advantage of the opportunity to raid the Reach, capturing or sinking quite a few ships, including around a dozen Red Wine ships, before heading off to Essos to find Daenerys. Now, the Red Wine Fleet is on its way west to defend the Reach, though when they make it back, they'll find there isn't an Iron Fleet to defend against anymore. And that's a great example of the problems that the Red Wine Fleet is going to face going forward. As the only remaining major fleet in the south of Westeros, they'll have a huge coastline to defend, with multiple major ports spread along the coastline that will need defending, and with news traveling so slowly over such long distances, they're going to have a hard time trying to be everywhere at once. So functionally, Wyman Manderley is in a far better position trying to defend this much coastline with up to 50 ships, compared to Paxter Redwine trying to defend this much coastline with 200 ships. Things will inevitably start falling through the cracks, and in fact they already have, such as the Ironborn attack on the Reach, and Aegon Targaryen and the Golden Company crossing the Narrow Sea and attacking the Stormlands. So now that I'm at the end of this second video, some of you may ask, why spend so much time discussing Wyman Manderley and House Manderley? Wyman is admittedly a minor character in the books and barely appears at all in the show. Well, the way I see it, there are only 2 broad strokes that matter more to the future of Westeros than anything else. There are the others trying to cross the Wall, and there is Daenerys trying to cross the Narrow Sea with an army and her dragons. Now, to defend against the others trying to cross the Wall, someone is going to need dragon glass. And we know that the best source of dragon glass is at dragon stone. And dragon stone can't be taken without a fleet. And similarly, Daenerys is currently on the wrong side of the Narrow Sea to effect an invasion of Westeros. If she's going to invade, she's going to need ships. And if anyone is going to stop her, they're going to need ships as well. But while the events of the books have primarily focused on politics and the events happening on the continents of Westeros and Essos, George R. R. Martin has been slowly but surely whittling down the various fleets of Westeros until all that remains is the overstretched Red Wine fleet and the secret Manderley fleet that has yet to take the field, or take the sea as it were. And finally, we should consider money, which makes everything else happen. With enough money, someone could stop the invasion of the others, or the invasion of the dragons, or both. We have the Iron Bank of Braavos, which feels that it is owed an enormous sum by the realm, perhaps upwards of several million gold dragons. And the bank has demonstrated in the past at having effective and sometimes devastating methods of ensuring that their debts are repaid. And whoever intends to be king or queen of Westeros will have to figure out how they will pay that debt. And with much of the wealth of the realm depleted by costly wars, and with much of the economy of the realm damaged by the ravages of war, this is going to be a difficult prospect. Whoever takes the throne will need to have the support of wealthy vassals. And in the north, this means going to House Manderley, the one-stop shop for all of your wealth needs. So like I concluded in my first video, for the upcoming books, I predict House Manderley is going to be the linchpin where naval power and economic power is concerned. Thank you all for watching, and as always, please feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments below. And stay tuned for the next theory video, which will cover the Horn of Joramun.